The morning sun cast long shadows across the military compound as Lieutenant Sarah Mitchell stood rigidly at attention with her fellow officers. The air was thick with tension and the weight of protocol that had governed military life for generations. Today was different from the countless other morning assemblies she had attended during her 3 years of service. Today, General Harrison Blackwood, the most decorated and feared commander in the entire military division, was making his first official visit to their base. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she maintained her position in the front row, her crisp uniform pressed to perfection, her boots polished until they reflected the early morning light like mirrors. She had spent hours the night before ensuring every detail of her appearance met the exacting standards expected when greeting a general of Blackwood's stature. Her fellow officers stood motionless around her, each one acutely aware that this moment could define their military careers. The sound of approaching vehicles broke the silence that had settled over the courtyard. A convoy of black military cars rolled through the main gates, their engines purring with the quiet efficiency that spoke of government importance. The lead vehicle, an imposing sedan with tinted windows and military plates, came to a stop directly in front of the assembled troops. For a moment, nothing moved except the gentle flutter of the American flag in the morning breeze. Then, the rear door opened, and General Blackwood emerged. He was exactly as Sarah had imagined from the stories and photographs she had seen throughout her military training. Tall and commanding, with silver hair that caught the sunlight and eyes that seemed to take in everything with a single sweeping glance. His uniform was adorned with ribbons and medals that told the story of a lifetime devoted to military service and excellence. The general's presence seemed to fill the entire courtyard, and Sarah felt the collective intake of breath from the soldiers around her. Colonel Martinez, the base commander, stepped forward with quick, precise movements. His salute was sharp and held for exactly the appropriate duration as he addressed their distinguished visitor. The formal exchange of greetings carried across the silent courtyard, each word carefully chosen and delivered with the respect due to a man of General Blackwood's rank and reputation. As the general began his inspection of the troops, Sarah felt her heart racing in her chest. She had prepared for this moment, knowing that everything about her bearing, her appearance, and her response would be scrutinized and remembered. The general moved methodically down the line of officers, pausing occasionally to exchange brief words with individuals who caught his attention. His aide, a stern-faced captain with a clipboard, followed closely behind, making notes that would undoubtedly become part of official reports. When General Blackwood finally reached Sarah's position, she felt the full weight of his attention settle upon her. His eyes, sharp and intelligent, seemed to look directly through her as he conducted his assessment. The moment stretched longer than it should have, and Sarah began to feel something stirring within her that she had not expected. It was not fear or nervousness, though both of those emotions were present. It was something deeper, something that connected to memories she had tried for years to keep buried. The general's face, now only a few feet away, triggered a cascade of images that flashed through Sarah's mind like scenes from a half-remembered dream. She saw herself as a child, no more than 8 years old, sitting in a small, dimly lit room while adults spoke in hushed, urgent voices beyond the door. She remembered the sound of her mother crying, a sound that had haunted her for 20 years. She remembered the way her father's shoulders had slumped when he received news that changed everything about their family's future. As these memories flooded back with startling clarity, Sarah found herself studying the general's features with new intensity. The shape of his jaw, the particular way his eyes crinkled at the corners, the distinctive scar that ran along his left temple. Details that had seemed insignificant moments before now took on profound meaning. Her breath caught in her throat as recognition dawned, a recognition that threatened to shatter the composure she had worked so hard to maintain. The general's inspection continued, but Sarah was no longer fully present in the moment. Her mind raced back through the years to a time when her family had lived in base housing at Fort Carson, when her father had been a rising star in the military hierarchy, and when her mother had still smiled regularly. She remembered fragments of conversations she had overheard as a child, conversations about injustice and betrayal, about careers destroyed and families ruined by the actions of powerful men who believed themselves above accountability. The name that had been whispered in her childhood home with such pain and anger now had a face standing directly in front of her. General Harrison Blackwood, the hero of military campaigns and recipient of countless honors, was the same man who had systematically destroyed her father's career 20 years earlier. The same man who had used his influence and connections to ensure that Major James Mitchell would never advance beyond his current rank, never receive the assignments he deserved, and never clear his name from false accusations that had been carefully orchestrated. Sarah's hands clenched into fists at her sides as the full weight of this realization settled over her. She remembered her father's gradual descent into depression and alcoholism, the way he had retreated from his family as his military dreams crumbled around him. She remembered her mother's desperate attempts to hold their family together while dealing with the shame and isolation that came with her husband's professional destruction. She remembered the day they had been forced to leave base housing and start over in a civilian world that her father had never been prepared to navigate. The general was speaking now, his voice carrying the authority and confidence that had made him a legend within military circles. He was discussing readiness and excellence, the importance of duty and honor, the sacred trust between soldiers and their commanders. Each word felt like a mockery to Sarah, who knew the truth about the man delivering these noble sentiments. She felt anger rising within her, a hot, dangerous emotion that threatened to override years of military discipline and training. But alongside the anger was something else, something that surprised her with its intensity. It was a sense of purpose, a feeling that fate had brought her to this moment for a reason. She had spent 20 years watching her family struggle with the consequences of this man's actions. She had seen her father waste away, never fully understanding why his career had been destroyed or who had been responsible. Her mother had carried the weight of unanswered questions until the day she died, 5 years earlier, still believing that someday the truth would come to light. Now Sarah stood face to face with the architect of her family's destruction, and she realized that this might be the only opportunity she would ever have to confront him. The military protocol that governed every aspect of their interaction suddenly felt like a constraint rather than a structure. The expected responses, the required deference, the automatic submission to rank and authority, all of it seemed designed to protect men like Blackwood from ever having to face the consequences of their actions. The general finished his remarks and turned his attention back to the individual soldiers before him. When his gaze returned to Sarah, she felt something shift inside her. The frightened child who had hidden in her room while her parents fought about their uncertain future was gone, replaced by a woman who had spent years in the military learning about justice, honor, and the courage required to stand up for what was right. The moment of decision approached like a storm gathering on the horizon. Sarah knew that what happened next would define not just this encounter, but potentially the rest of her military career and her ability to live with herself. The other officers around her remained perfectly still, awaiting the signal to render the traditional salute that would mark the formal conclusion of the general's inspection. As General Blackwood raised his hand in preparation for the salute, Sarah felt time slow to a crawl. Every detail of the moment became crystal clear. The way the morning light reflected off the general's medals, the sound of boots shifting slightly on gravel as soldiers prepared for the ritual, the distant noise of daily base operations continuing beyond the courtyard. She was aware of her own heartbeat, strong and steady despite the magnitude of what she was about to do. The command came sharp and clear across the courtyard. Soldiers throughout the formation raised their hands in perfect unison, a choreographed display of respect and military precision that had been repeated countless times throughout history. But Sarah's hand remained at her side, her fingers steady and her gaze fixed directly on the general's face. The silence that followed was deafening. What should have been a moment of routine military ceremony suddenly became something else entirely. Sarah could feel the shock ripple through the ranks around her as officers processed what they were witnessing. Someone, a junior lieutenant with barely 3 years of service, had just refused to salute a 3-star general during an official inspection. General Blackwood's expression shifted from mild surprise to something approaching disbelief. His hand remained raised in the salute position, but his eyes narrowed as he focused on the young officer who had broken protocol in such a dramatic and unprecedented way. The aide beside him looked as though he had witnessed something akin to treason, his pen frozen over his clipboard as he struggled to process what should be recorded in the official report. Colonel Martinez stepped forward, his face flushed with embarrassment and anger. The reputation of his entire command was suddenly at stake, and he seemed torn between the desire to immediately discipline the insubordinate officer and the need to manage the situation without further embarrassing their distinguished visitor. His voice, when it came, was tight with barely controlled emotion. But before the colonel could speak, Sarah took a step forward. Her movement was deliberate and controlled, a clear indication that her actions were not the result of confusion or momentary lapse in judgment. She looked directly at General Blackwood, her eyes meeting his without flinching, and opened her mouth to speak. The words that came next would change everything. They would transform a routine military inspection into something that none of the participants would ever forget. They would force a reckoning that had been 20 years in the making and bring to light truths that powerful people had worked very hard to keep buried. Sarah's voice, when she finally spoke, was clear and steady. She knew that she was about to cross a line from which there could be no return, but she also knew that she owed it to her father's memory and her own integrity to speak the truth that had been silenced for too long. The weight of 2 decades of injustice pressed down upon her as she prepared to whisper the name that would stun the general and everyone else who heard it. The tension in the courtyard had become almost unbearable as Sarah stood motionless, her refusal to salute creating a breach in military protocol that seemed to echo across the silent compound. General Blackwood's hand slowly lowered from his salute position, his eyes never leaving her face as he tried to understand what had just transpired. The other officers remained frozen in their positions, uncertain whether to maintain their salutes or follow their colonel's lead in addressing this unprecedented situation. Sarah could feel the weight of every gaze in the courtyard, but her focus remained entirely on the general's face. 20 years of wondering, 20 years of watching her family suffer from the consequences of decisions made in military offices far from their small base housing unit, had led to this singular moment of truth. Her father's voice echoed in her memory, the way he had spoken late at night when he thought no one was listening, about the injustice that had destroyed his career and the man who had orchestrated it all. "Major James Mitchell," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the silent courtyard. The effect was immediate and dramatic. General Blackwood's composed expression cracked for just a moment, revealing something that might have been recognition, surprise, or perhaps guilt. The name hung in the air between them like a challenge that could not be ignored or dismissed. Sarah watched as the general's mind clearly raced to place the name, to understand its significance, and why this young officer would speak it in such circumstances. Colonel Martinez stepped forward, his face now red with anger and embarrassment. He had commanded this base for 3 years and had never experienced such a breach of military discipline during an official function. His career was now potentially at risk because of this lieutenant's inexplicable behavior, and he was struggling to find a way to salvage the situation while maintaining some semblance of military order. "Lieutenant Mitchell," the colonel began, his voice sharp with authority and warning. "You will render the proper salute immediately and return to ranks. Your conduct is completely unacceptable and will be dealt with through appropriate disciplinary channels." But Sarah did not move. Instead, she continued to look directly at General Blackwood, waiting for some acknowledgement of the name she had spoken. She could see that he was remembering now, pieces of a puzzle from 2 decades ago falling into place as he studied her features and processed the implications of her surname combined with her unprecedented behavior. General Blackwood raised a hand to stop the colonel's intervention. His voice, when he spoke, was controlled but carried an undertone that suggested he was far from as composed as he appeared. "Colonel Martinez, I believe I can handle this situation. Perhaps we should move this discussion to a more appropriate venue." The suggestion was clearly a command, though delivered with the diplomatic language that senior officers used when they wanted to maintain face while addressing delicate situations. The general's aide stepped forward to begin organizing the movement away from the public courtyard, but his face showed the confusion of someone who had witnessed something completely outside his experience. Sarah knew that accepting the general's suggestion would mean submitting to the chain of command and allowing the conversation to be controlled by military hierarchy and protocol. Once they moved to the colonel's office or another formal setting, her opportunity to speak truth to power would be constrained by the very structures that had protected men like Blackwood for decades. She made a decision that surprised even herself. "With respect, General Blackwood," she said, maintaining her position and her direct gaze. "I believe this conversation needs to happen here, now, in the presence of these officers who have sworn the same oath to honor and integrity that you have." The audacity of her response sent another shock wave through the assembled troops. Junior officers simply did not speak to generals in such a manner, particularly not during official inspections, and certainly not after already committing such a serious breach of protocol. Sarah could hear the sharp intake of breath from soldiers around her, and could sense that she was pushing far beyond the boundaries of acceptable military behavior. But she also sensed something else in the general's reaction. Behind the mask of authority and control, she detected uncertainty and perhaps even fear. The mention of her father's name had clearly affected him more than he wanted to reveal, and his desire to move their conversation away from public scrutiny suggested that he understood the potential implications of what she might have to say. General Blackwood studied her for a long moment, his experienced mind undoubtedly weighing options and considering consequences. He was a man who had spent decades navigating the complex political landscape of military command, making decisions that affected thousands of lives and careers. But now he found himself in an unexpected situation with a junior officer who seemed prepared to challenge him in ways that his rank and reputation should have protected him from. "Very well, Lieutenant," he said finally, his voice carrying a tone that mixed authority with resignation. "You clearly have something you believe needs to be said. I'm prepared to listen, though I hope you understand the serious nature of your conduct here today." Sarah felt a surge of both relief and terror. She had succeeded in creating the opportunity she needed, but now she had to follow through with accusations that could destroy her military career and potentially expose her to charges of insubordination or worse. The words she spoke next would either vindicate 20 years of family suffering or mark the end of everything she had worked to build in her own military service. 20 years ago, she began, her voice steady despite the enormity of what she was about to reveal. "You destroyed my father's career through false accusations and political manipulation. Major James Mitchell was a good soldier and an honest man who threatened your advancement because he discovered irregularities in supply contracts that you were personally benefiting from." The courtyard fell completely silent except for the distant sounds of normal base operations. Even the wind seemed to have stopped as Sarah's words cut through the morning air like a blade. She could see the general's face changing as she spoke, the careful mask of authority giving way to something more complex and troubling. "My father uncovered evidence that you were taking kickbacks from defense contractors in exchange for favorable treatment in the bidding process for equipment and supplies," Sarah continued, her voice growing stronger as she spoke truths that had been buried for 2 decades. "When he attempted to report these irregularities through proper channels, you used your influence and connections to have him investigated for the very crimes you were committing." General Blackwood's aide was frantically taking notes now, though whether for official documentation or damage control was unclear. Colonel Martinez looked as though he wanted to disappear entirely rather than be present for this unprecedented confrontation between a lieutenant and a 3-star general. The other officers remained frozen in position, witnesses to what was becoming one of the most dramatic moments in the recent history of their base. "You planted evidence in his office," Sarah pressed on, her memories now flowing freely as she recounted the events that had destroyed her family. "You arranged for him to be assigned to investigations and positions where he would look guilty of the very corruption he was trying to expose. You systematically destroyed his reputation, his career prospects, and his ability to provide for his family." The general's response, when it came, was delivered in the measured tones of someone who had spent years in courtrooms and congressional hearings defending his decisions and actions. "Lieutenant Mitchell, these are extremely serious accusations you're making. Accusations that, if made without proper evidence and foundation, could constitute defamation and conduct unbecoming an officer." But Sarah was no longer intimidated by threats or warnings. She had crossed the point of no return when she refused to salute, and now she was committed to speaking the complete truth regardless of the consequences. "I have evidence, General. My father kept copies of documents, recordings of conversations, and detailed records of his investigations. Everything he discovered about your corruption and the methods you used to silence him." The revelation that evidence still existed clearly caught General Blackwood off guard. His carefully controlled expression slipped for a moment, revealing something that looked remarkably like panic before the mask of authority returned. Sarah could see that he was rapidly calculating the potential damage that such evidence could cause to his reputation and legacy. "After you destroyed his career," Sarah continued, "my father spent years trying to clear his name and expose the truth about what really happened. But you had risen too high and gained too much influence for anyone to take his accusations seriously. He died 5 years ago, still carrying the shame of crimes he never committed and injustices he could never prove." The personal cost of the general's actions was becoming clear to everyone present. This was not simply a matter of military politics or career advancement. It was about the destruction of a family, the waste of a good soldier's life, and the corruption of the very values that the military claimed to represent. General Blackwood seemed to realize that the situation had moved far beyond his ability to control through traditional military hierarchy. The presence of so many witnesses, the specific nature of the accusations, and the apparent existence of evidence created a set of circumstances that could not be simply dismissed or buried through the normal channels of military discipline. "Lieutenant Mitchell," he said, his voice now carrying a tone of someone who was negotiating rather than commanding. "I think we need to discuss this matter in detail and with proper consideration for all the facts and circumstances involved. Perhaps we should indeed move to a more appropriate setting where we can have a thorough and complete conversation about these allegations." But Sarah had learned from her father's experience that once powerful people gained control of the conversation, they found ways to manipulate, obscure, and ultimately bury the truth. She was not going to allow General Blackwood the opportunity to retreat to friendly territory where he could use his rank and influence to minimize the impact of her revelations. "No, General," she said firmly. "The time for private conversations and backroom deals ended 20 years ago when you chose to destroy an honest soldier rather than face the consequences of your own corruption. Everything that needs to be said can be said here, in front of these officers who deserve to know the truth about the man they're being asked to respect and follow." The challenge was now complete and undeniable. Sarah had not only refused to show the traditional respect due to the general's rank, but had publicly accused him of corruption, abuse of power, and the destruction of her father's life and career. The assembled officers were witnesses to accusations that, if proven true, would represent one of the most serious betrayals of military honor and trust in recent history. General Blackwood looked around the courtyard, taking in the faces of the soldiers who were hanging on every word of this extraordinary confrontation. He seemed to be weighing his options, considering whether to continue the public discussion or attempt to use his authority to shut down the conversation entirely. But Sarah had given him few choices that would not make him appear guilty of the very crime she was describing. The morning sun had climbed higher during their exchange, and the shadows in the courtyard had shifted, but the tension remained as thick and oppressive as storm clouds. Everyone present understood that they were witnessing something that would be remembered and discussed for years to come, regardless of how it ultimately resolved. General Blackwood's weathered face betrayed decades of military training as he attempted to maintain composure in the face of Sarah's devastating accusations. The assembled officers watched in stunned silence as the confrontation unfolded before them, each understanding that they were witnessing something that would forever change their perception of military leadership and the price of speaking truth to power. Sarah felt the weight of 20 years pressing down upon her shoulders as she prepared to reveal the most damaging evidence her father had collected. In her apartment, locked away in a safe deposit box that she had maintained since his death, lay documents and recordings that could potentially destroy not just General Blackwood's career, but implicate others who had been part of the conspiracy to silence her father's investigations. "My father recorded conversations, General," Sarah said, her voice cutting through the morning air with razor-sharp precision, "including phone calls where you discussed specific amounts of money, particular contracts, and the methods you planned to use to discredit him before he could expose your operations." The general's aide stopped writing entirely, his pen hovering over his clipboard as he processed the implications of what he was hearing. If recordings existed that documented corruption and conspiracy at the highest levels of military command, the scandal could reach far beyond General Blackwood himself. Careers would be destroyed, reputations ruined, and the military's public standing severely damaged. Colonel Martinez had gone completely pale, realizing that his base was now at the center of what could become one of the most significant military scandals in recent history. His own career trajectory would be affected by how he handled this situation, but, more importantly, he was beginning to understand that he might be witnessing the exposure of systemic corruption that had been operating within their command structure for decades. "You're referring to events that allegedly occurred 20 years ago," General Blackwood said, his voice carefully modulated to project authority despite the obvious stress he was experiencing. "Even if such recordings existed, which I seriously doubt, the passage of time and the lack of proper chain of custody would make them inadmissible and unreliable." But Sarah had anticipated this response. Her father had been a meticulous soldier who understood the importance of documentation and evidence preservation. During his final years, as his health declined and he realized that he might never live to see justice served, he had taken steps to ensure that his evidence would survive him and remain legally viable. The recordings were properly preserved and authenticated, Sarah replied, her confidence growing as she sensed the general's increasing discomfort. My father worked with a private investigator and a retired military lawyer to ensure that everything was documented according to legal standards. He also made multiple copies and stored them in different locations to prevent any attempts at destruction or suppression. The revelation that her father had taken such extensive precautions clearly unsettled General Blackwood further. His career had been built on the assumption that his early corruption had been successfully buried, and that no credible evidence existed to challenge the official narrative that had destroyed Major Mitchell's reputation. The possibility that detailed documentation of his crimes had survived for 2 decades represented a threat to everything he had built since then. Sarah could see that some of the assembled officers were beginning to process the implications of what they were hearing. These were men and women who had devoted their lives to military service, who believed in honor, integrity, and justice. The idea that their command structure might be built on corruption and lies was deeply disturbing to soldiers who had sacrificed so much in service to their country. Furthermore, Sarah continued, pressing her advantage as she sensed the general's weakness, the evidence includes documentation of your financial accounts during the period in question, bank records, property purchases, and lifestyle changes that could not be explained by your military salary alone. This revelation struck even deeper than the previous disclosures. Financial records were much harder to dismiss or explain away than conversation recordings, which could potentially be challenged as doctored or taken out of context. If Major Mitchell had succeeded in documenting the flow of money from defense contractors to General Blackwood's personal accounts, the evidence would be virtually irrefutable. General Blackwood's hands clenched slightly at his sides, the only visible sign of the internal turmoil he was experiencing. He was a man who had spent decades believing that his past was buried and secure, that his rise through the military ranks had been based on merit and achievement. Now he was confronting the possibility that everything could be destroyed by evidence he thought had died with his accuser. "Lieutenant Mitchell," he said, his voice now carrying a tone of someone who was beginning to negotiate from a position of weakness rather than command from a position of strength. "I think we both understand that the situation we're discussing is complex and involves many factors that may not be immediately apparent. Perhaps we should consider how best to address these concerns in a way that serves the interests of all parties involved." But Sarah recognized this language for what it was, the beginning of an attempt to find a compromise that would protect the general while silencing her accusations. It was exactly the kind of backroom dealing that had allowed his corruption to flourish 20 years earlier and had prevented her father from ever receiving justice. "There are no interests to consider except the truth, General," she responded firmly. "My father devoted his life to the military, and he died believing that the institution he loved had betrayed him. The only way to honor his service and sacrifice is to ensure that the truth is finally revealed, regardless of how uncomfortable it makes powerful people." The moral clarity of her statement resonated with many of the officers present. These were soldiers who had sworn oaths to defend the Constitution and uphold the values of their military service. The idea that corruption and conspiracy had been allowed to flourish while good soldiers like Major Mitchell were destroyed for trying to do the right thing represented a fundamental betrayal of everything they claimed to stand for. Captain Rodriguez, one of the younger officers in the formation, shifted slightly as he processed what he was hearing. He had joined the military because he believed in honor, integrity, and service to his country. The revelation that senior leadership might be corrupt and that whistleblowers were destroyed rather than protected challenged his fundamental assumptions about the institution he had committed his life to serving. Major Thompson, a logistics officer with 15 years of experience, was beginning to understand the broader implications of Sarah's accusations. If General Blackwood had indeed been taking kickbacks from defense contractors, it meant that procurement decisions had been made based on personal profit rather than the needs of soldiers in the field. Equipment purchases, supply contracts, and resource allocation decisions could have been compromised, potentially putting lives at risk. General Blackwood seemed to sense that he was losing control of the narrative and that the assembled officers were beginning to see him differently. The respect and deference that his rank had always commanded were being replaced by suspicion and doubt. His authority, built on decades of careful reputation management, was crumbling in real time. "I want to be very clear about something," he said, his voice taking on a more aggressive tone as he attempted to regain control of the situation. "Making false accusations against a senior officer is a serious offense under the Uniform Code of Military Justice. Lieutenant Mitchell, you are putting your entire career at risk with these allegations." The threat was unmistakable, but Sarah had moved beyond fear of personal consequences. She had watched her father destroy himself trying to expose the truth while being careful to follow proper channels and avoid offense to his superiors. His caution and respect for authority had ultimately led to his downfall and the suppression of evidence that could have brought justice. "My career is not worth protecting if it means allowing corruption and injustice to continue," Sarah replied without hesitation. "My father taught me that some things are more important than personal advancement or professional security. Honor, integrity, and truth are worth fighting for, regardless of the cost." Her words carried the weight of genuine conviction, and they resonated with military values that all the assembled officers had sworn to uphold. The contrast between her principled stand and the general's apparent attempts to suppress and threaten was becoming increasingly clear to everyone present. Colonel Martinez found himself in an impossible position. As the base commander, he was responsible for maintaining discipline and order, but he was also witnessing what appeared to be credible accusations of high-level corruption. His duty to support the chain of command was in direct conflict with his obligation to investigate potential misconduct and protect soldiers who reported wrongdoing. "General Blackwood," the colonel said carefully, his voice betraying his internal struggle, "perhaps we should consider establishing a formal investigation to examine these allegations through proper channels. If there has been misconduct, it needs to be addressed. If the accusations are false, then Lieutenant Mitchell should face appropriate consequences for her actions today." The suggestion of a formal investigation clearly alarmed the general, who understood that such a process would be much harder to control than the current confrontation. Military investigations, particularly those involving high-ranking officers and serious allegations of corruption, took on lives of their own and could expose secrets that had been buried for decades. "Colonel," General Blackwood responded, his voice sharp with authority, "I don't believe that formal investigation procedures are necessary at this point. Lieutenant Mitchell is clearly acting out of personal grief and misguided loyalty to her father's memory. What we're witnessing here is insubordination, not legitimate whistleblowing." But Sarah was not going to allow him to dismiss her accusations as emotional instability or personal vendetta. The evidence her father had collected was substantial and credible, and she was prepared to present it to anyone willing to examine it objectively. "The evidence speaks for itself, General," she said with quiet confidence. "Bank records, recorded conversations, documented meetings, and witness statements all paint a clear picture of systematic corruption and abuse of power. My father may be gone, but his work to expose the truth survived him." The standoff continued as each participant weighed their options and considered the potential consequences of their next actions. General Blackwood faced the possibility that his carefully constructed reputation and legacy could be destroyed by evidence he had believed was safely buried. Sarah knew that she had committed herself to a course of action that would likely end her military career, but might finally vindicate her father's memory and expose the truth that had been hidden for so long. The assembled officers found themselves unwilling witnesses to a confrontation that challenged their fundamental beliefs about military leadership and the integrity of their command structure. The morning that had begun as a routine inspection was transforming into a moment of truth that would force everyone present to choose between loyalty to authority and commitment to justice. The tension in the courtyard had reached a breaking point when Captain Williams, the base's senior legal officer, stepped forward from his position in the rear rank. His movement was deliberate and measured, and his presence immediately added a new dimension to the confrontation that was unfolding before them. As someone trained in military law and procedure, he understood better than most the legal implications of what Sarah was alleging and what General Blackwood's responses might mean. "General Blackwood," Captain Williams said, his voice carefully neutral but carrying the authority of his legal expertise, "if Lieutenant Mitchell is prepared to present credible evidence of the allegations she's making, military law requires that we at least examine that evidence through appropriate channels. Dismissing such claims without proper investigation could itself constitute a violation of regulations regarding the reporting and investigation of misconduct. The legal officer's intervention clearly frustrated General Blackwood, who had been working to control the narrative and minimize the impact of Sarah's accusations. Having a military lawyer point out his obligations under regulations made it much harder to simply dismiss the situation as the ravings of a disgruntled subordinate. Sarah felt a surge of gratitude toward Captain Williams, recognizing that he was taking a professional and personal risk by speaking up in such circumstances. Junior officers rarely challenged the preferences of visiting generals, particularly when those preferences involved avoiding investigations that could prove embarrassing or damaging to senior leadership. Captain Williams, General Blackwood responded, his tone carrying a warning that the legal officer was straying into dangerous territory. I believe I'm qualified to determine what does and does not require formal investigation. Lieutenant Mitchell's accusations are clearly the result of personal grief and misplaced blame for her family's difficulties. But the general's attempt to frame the situation as an emotional outburst rather than a serious allegation was becoming less credible as Sarah continued to demonstrate detailed knowledge of specific events and claimed to possess substantial evidence. The assembled officers were beginning to understand that this was not simply a daughter's attempt to defend her father's reputation, but potentially the exposure of a genuine conspiracy that had operated for decades. Sarah recognized that Captain Williams had created an opening for her to present her case more formally. Rather than continuing to trade accusations with the general, she could now focus on presenting the evidence that her father had so carefully preserved and documented. I appreciate Captain Williams's clarification of the legal requirements, Sarah said, her voice gaining strength as she realized that military law might actually protect her right to present evidence of wrongdoing. I'm prepared to provide documentation that includes recorded conversations, financial records, and witness statements that support every allegation I've made here today. The specificity of her claims was clearly making General Blackwood increasingly uncomfortable. If she truly possessed recorded conversations, they would be much harder to deny or explain away than general accusations of corruption. Financial records would provide objective evidence that could be independently verified. Witness statements would indicate that other people had been aware of the corruption and could potentially corroborate her father's discoveries. Colonel Martinez found himself in the difficult position of trying to balance his duty to support visiting senior leadership with his obligation to ensure that proper procedures were followed when serious allegations were made. The presence of Captain Williams had reminded everyone that military regulations existed specifically to protect whistleblowers and ensure that misconduct was properly investigated. Lieutenant Mitchell, the colonel said carefully, are you formally requesting an investigation into the allegations you've made against General Blackwood? The question hung in the air like a challenge that could not be ignored. If Sarah formally requested an investigation, military regulations would require that it be conducted, regardless of the political implications or potential embarrassment to senior leadership. But making such a formal request would also commit her to a course of action that would almost certainly end her military career, regardless of the outcome. Sarah looked around the courtyard at the assembled officers, many of whom had become her friends and colleagues over the 3 years she had served at this base. She thought about her father, who had faced a similar moment of decision 20 years earlier when he first discovered evidence of General Blackwood's corruption. He had tried to work within the system, following proper channels and showing appropriate respect for authority. His caution had ultimately led to his destruction. Yes, Colonel Martinez, she said clearly, her voice carrying across the silent courtyard. I am formally requesting a full investigation into General Blackwood's conduct during his service at Fort Carson from 2002 to 2005, including but not limited to allegations of bribery, conspiracy, abuse of authority, and obstruction of justice. The formal nature of her request changed everything. What had begun as an unprecedented breach of military protocol during a routine inspection had now become an official allegation of serious criminal misconduct by a 3-star general. The assembled officers understood that they were no longer simply witnesses to an unusual confrontation, but potential participants in a military investigation that could reach the highest levels of command. General Blackwood's face had grown increasingly pale as he processed the implications of Sarah's formal request. Military investigations, particularly those involving allegations of criminal conduct, followed specific procedures that would be difficult for him to influence or control. Evidence would be examined by trained investigators, witnesses would be interviewed under oath, and findings would be documented in official reports that could not be easily suppressed. Colonel Martinez, the general said, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. I strongly advise you to consider the implications of entertaining such obviously false and malicious allegations. Lieutenant Mitchell's conduct today demonstrates that she is not a reliable or credible source of information about events that allegedly occurred before she even entered military service. But Captain Williams stepped forward again, his legal training compelling him to ensure that proper procedures were followed regardless of the political pressure being applied. General Blackwood, military regulations are quite clear about the requirements for investigating allegations of misconduct by senior officers. The credibility of the person making the allegations is determined during the investigation process, not beforehand. The legal officer's statement effectively removed General Blackwood's ability to simply dismiss the investigation based on his personal assessment of Sarah's credibility or motivations. Military law had been designed specifically to prevent senior officers from suppressing investigations into their own conduct, and Captain Williams was ensuring that those protections were properly applied. Sarah felt a mixture of relief and terror as she realized that she had succeeded in triggering the formal investigation process that her father had never been able to achieve. But she also understood that General Blackwood would not simply accept this development passively. He had spent 20 years building his reputation and consolidating his power, and he would undoubtedly use every resource at his disposal to protect himself. I want to make something very clear to everyone present, General Blackwood said, his voice now carrying the full authority of his rank and the implied threat of his influence. False allegations against senior officers are taken very seriously by military justice authorities. Lieutenant Mitchell may find that her decision to make these accusations results in consequences she has not fully considered. The threat was unmistakable, but it also revealed the general's awareness that he could no longer simply dismiss the situation. His resort to intimidation suggested that he understood the potential seriousness of the evidence that Sarah claimed to possess and was attempting to discourage her from proceeding further. But Sarah had moved beyond fear of personal consequences. She had watched her father spend the final years of his life carrying the burden of injustice and being unable to clear his name. She had seen her mother struggle with the shame and uncertainty that came with being married to a man whose career had been destroyed by accusations that she could never fully understand or challenge. General Blackwood, she responded with calm determination, my father spent 20 years living with the consequences of your corruption and abuse of power. He died without ever seeing justice served or his reputation restored. I'm prepared to accept whatever consequences come from finally exposing the truth about what you did to him and potentially to other soldiers who threatened your interests. Her words carried the weight of genuine conviction and personal sacrifice. The assembled officers could see that she was not acting out of personal ambition or spite, but from a deep commitment to justice and honor that transcended concerns about her own career or welfare. Major Thompson, who had been processing the implications of the corruption allegations for military procurement, finally spoke up. Lieutenant Mitchell, if what you're alleging is true, it would mean that equipment and supply decisions were made based on personal profit rather than the needs of soldiers in the field. Lives could have been put at risk by compromised procurement processes. His observation added another dimension to the allegations that made them even more serious. Corruption in military procurement was not simply a matter of personal enrichment, but potentially a betrayal of the troops who depended on proper equipment and supplies for their safety and effectiveness in combat situations. General Blackwood realized that the situation was spiraling beyond his control as more officers began to speak up and consider the broader implications of Sarah's allegations. What had begun as a personal attack on his reputation was becoming a systematic examination of the potential consequences of corruption throughout the military procurement system. Major Thompson, he said sharply, I would advise you to be very careful about speculating on matters that are not within your area of expertise or responsibility. Making unfounded connections between personal allegations and operational decisions could itself constitute misconduct. But the general's attempt to silence further discussion was becoming increasingly ineffective as the assembled officers began to understand that they might have been serving under a command structure that was fundamentally compromised. The values they had sworn to uphold, honor, integrity, and service before self, seemed to have been violated at the highest levels. Sarah could see that the momentum was shifting in her favor as more officers began to question the general's responses and consider the implications of her allegations. But She also understood that this was only the beginning of a process that would likely take months or years to complete and would require her to maintain her resolve in the face of intense pressure from powerful enemies. Captain Williams consulted a small notebook he carried, reviewing the specific regulations that governed investigations into senior officer misconduct. "Colonel Martinez," he said formally, "based on Lieutenant Mitchell's formal request for investigation and the nature of the allegations she's made, I believe we are required to notify the Inspector General's office and begin preliminary evidence preservation procedures immediately." The mention of the Inspector General's office clearly alarmed General Blackwood further. The IG had the authority and independence necessary to conduct thorough investigations into high-level misconduct without interference from the normal chain of command. Once they became involved, even a three-star general would find it difficult to suppress or control the investigation process. The morning sun had climbed high overhead during their lengthy confrontation, but none of the assembled officers seemed aware of the passage of time. They were all processing the reality that they were witnessing what could become one of the most significant military scandals in recent history, with implications that could reach far beyond General Blackwood himself. As Sarah stood in the courtyard, surrounded by fellow officers who were beginning to understand the magnitude of what she had revealed, she felt the weight of 20 years of injustice finally beginning to shift. Her father's evidence would soon be examined by trained investigators. His allegations, the recordings captured not only General Blackwood's voice discussing specific bribes and payoffs, but also conversations with other high-ranking officers who had been part of the conspiracy. Financial records showed a pattern of unexplained wealth that coincided perfectly with major defense contracts. Most devastatingly, the investigation uncovered additional victims, other honest soldiers whose careers had been destroyed when they threatened to expose the corruption network. Sarah sat in the small conference room at the Pentagon, waiting to testify before the Senate Armed Services Committee. The formal hearing was the culmination of months of investigation by the Inspector General's office, the FBI, and congressional investigators who had been stunned by the scope of the corruption they uncovered. Her testimony would be broadcast live on national television, ensuring that the truth her father died trying to expose would finally be heard by the American people. General Blackwood had been arrested 3 weeks earlier at his home in Virginia. The sight of the decorated war hero being led away in handcuffs had sent shockwaves through the military establishment and beyond. 7 other senior officers had also been charged with various crimes related to the procurement conspiracy, and investigators were still following leads that suggested the corruption had affected defense contracts worth hundreds of millions of dollars over more than a decade. The personal cost to Sarah had been significant, but somehow felt manageable in light of what had been accomplished. She had been transferred from her original base within days of making her formal allegations, both for her own protection and to avoid any appearance of retaliation. Her military career was effectively over. No one wanted to work with the officer who had brought down a general and exposed systemic corruption, regardless of how justified her actions had been. But Sarah found that she was at peace with these consequences. In her apartment in Washington, she kept a framed photograph of her father in his dress uniform, taken during his early years when his future had seemed bright and full of promise. She often looked at that photograph and imagined telling him that justice had finally been served, that his sacrifice had not been in vain, and that the truth he had died protecting was now known by the world. The hearing room was packed with journalists, military officials, family members of affected soldiers, and citizens who had followed the scandal as it unfolded in the media. The story had captured public attention not just because of the dramatic circumstances of its initial revelation, but because it represented fundamental questions about honor, integrity, and accountability in institutions that demanded public trust. Senator Patricia Morrison, the committee chairwoman, called the hearing to order with words that acknowledged the gravity of what they were examining. The allegations and evidence we will review today strike at the heart of military honor and the sacred trust between our service members and the American people. The courage of those who spoke truth to power, often at great personal cost, has made this investigation possible. Sarah's testimony was scheduled to be the centerpiece of the day's proceedings, but she would be preceded by other witnesses who would provide context for the broader investigation. Colonel Martinez, her former base commander, testified about the morning when Sarah had refused to salute and the immediate aftermath of her allegations. Captain Williams explained the legal framework that had protected her right to make formal accusations and request an investigation. When Sarah was finally Called to testify, she walked to the witness table with the same steady confidence she had shown that morning in the courtyard. The cameras focused on her as she raised her right hand and swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. She thought of her father and knew that this moment was what he would have wanted. The truth finally, being told in a forum where it could not be suppressed or ignored. Her testimony began with her childhood memories of her father's investigation and the gradual destruction of his career. She spoke about watching him struggle with depression and alcoholism as he tried to cope with the injustice he had experienced. She described her mother's attempts to hold their family together while dealing with shame and uncertainty about accusations they could never fully understand or challenge. "My father never stopped believing that the truth would eventually come to light," Sarah told the committee, her voice carrying clearly through the packed hearing room. Even in his darkest moments, when his career was destroyed and his reputation ruined, he continued to preserve evidence and document what had happened to him. "He taught me that honor is not about following orders blindly, but about having the courage to stand up for what is right, even when it costs everything." She then detailed the evidence that her father had preserved: the recorded conversations, the financial records, the documentation of meetings, and transactions that prove the extent of General Blackwood's corruption. The committee members listened intently as she explained how her father had worked with a private investigator and retired military lawyer to ensure that everything was properly preserved and authenticated according to legal standards. Senator Morrison asked about the personal cost of her decision to come forward. Sarah's response was thoughtful and measured, reflecting months of contemplation about the choices she had made and their consequences. "Senator," she said, "my military career is effectively over because of what I've done. But I've seen what happens when good people stay silent in the face of corruption and injustice. My father's career was destroyed, my family was torn apart, and other honest soldiers suffered the same fate. The personal cost of speaking up is significant, but the cost of staying silent would have been much greater." The committee also heard testimony from other victims of General Blackwood's corruption network. Colonel Jennifer Hayes described how her investigation into suspicious supply contracts had led to false accusations against her and a forced early retirement that had cost her pension and benefits. Major Robert Santos testified about being transferred to undesirable assignments and passed over for promotions after he questioned irregularities in equipment procurement for his unit. Each testimony added another layer to the understanding of how systematically the corruption network had operated and how ruthlessly they had dealt with anyone who threatened to expose their activities. The committee members, regardless of their political affiliations, seemed genuinely shocked by the scope of the conspiracy and the number of careers that had been destroyed to protect it. The most dramatic moment of the hearing came when retired FBI agent Michael Chun testified about the investigation that had followed Sarah's allegations. Agent Chun had been assigned to lead the Financial Crimes Task Force that examined the evidence Major Mitchell had preserved, and his findings had provided the foundation for all the subsequent criminal charges. In 30 years of investigating financial crimes, Agent Chun told the committee, "I have rarely seen such meticulous documentation of criminal activity." Major Mitchell had essentially built a complete case file that included recorded confessions, documented financial transactions, and corroborated witness statements. His evidence was so comprehensive that it allowed us to secure search warrants and subpoenas that uncovered additional crimes we had not previously suspected. The agent's testimony vindicated Major Mitchell's investigative work and confirmed that his evidence met the highest standards for criminal prosecution. It also revealed the true scope of General Blackwood's criminal enterprise. The corruption had affected defense contracts worth over $400 million and had operated for more than 15 years before Major Mitchell began his investigation. As the day's testimony concluded, Senator Morrison made remarks that seemed to capture the significance of what had been revealed. The investigation and prosecution that followed Lieutenant Mitchell's courage in speaking truth to power has exposed one of the most serious cases of military corruption in our nation's history. But it has also demonstrated that our system of justice, when properly supported and protected, can still hold even the most powerful individuals accountable for their actions. Sarah left the hearing room knowing that her public testimony had been the final chapter in her father's fight for justice. The evidence he had preserved with such care and determination had finally been presented to the world, and the truth he had died trying to expose was now part of the official record. In the months that followed, the legal proceedings continued to unfold with relentless efficiency. General Blackwood was convicted on 17 counts of bribery, conspiracy, and abuse of authority. He was sentenced to 25 years in federal prison and ordered to pay restitution of over $12 million. 6 other senior officers received sentences ranging from 5 to 15 years, and several defense contractors were also prosecuted for their roles in the conspiracy. The military implemented sweeping reforms to procurement procedures and established new protections for whistleblowers who reported corruption and misconduct. Major Mitchell was posthumously exonerated of all charges that had been brought against him, and his military record was corrected to reflect his true service and sacrifice. Sarah received a formal apology from the Secretary of Defense and was offered the opportunity to continue her military career with a clean slate. But Sarah chose a different path. She accepted an honorable discharge from the military and used the settlement money from a lawsuit against General Blackwood to establish the James Mitchell Foundation for Military Justice. The foundation provided legal support and advocacy for service members who reported corruption, misconduct, and other violations of military honor. On the 5th anniversary of that morning in the courtyard, Sarah stood at her father's grave in Arlington National Cemetery. His headstone now included an inscription that read, "Devoted soldier, loving father, defender of truth." The shame and uncertainty that had surrounded his death had been replaced by recognition of his courage and integrity. As she placed fresh flowers on his grave, Sarah reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. Her refusal to salute had cost her the military career she had planned, but it had also vindicated her father's memory and potentially prevented other families from experiencing the same injustice they had endured. The morning sun filtered through the trees of Arlington National Cemetery, casting dappled shadows on the thousands of white headstones that marked the final resting places of those who had served their country. Sarah stood quietly for several minutes, feeling the presence of her father and knowing that his sacrifice had finally been given the meaning and recognition it deserved. Walking away from the grave, she felt the weight of 20 years of injustice finally lifted from her shoulders. The whispered name that had stunned a general and changed everything had become a symbol of the power of truth and the courage required to speak it, regardless of the cost. Major James Mitchell's legacy would live on not in the corruption that had destroyed his career, but in the justice that his daughter's courage had finally secured.